Today I'm going to show you how to animate your 2D characters inside Unity. Since it is kind of a boring thing to have a character running around and not actually animating while it's running. Now before we get started, I want to mention that I'm going to be explaining how to do this using both a PNG image as well as when it comes to a PSB file, which is a Photoshop file. The process is slightly different along the way. There's a lot of material online showing how to do this using a PSB file, but there's not as much when it comes to showing how to do it using a PNG file. Now, because I want my tutorial to be available to everyone, even the people who don't have Photoshop, we will be focusing on doing this using a PNG file. But like I said, I will explain when you need to do something different if you're using a PSB file instead. First thing first, we do need to make a small change inside our character that we created last episode. You don't have to use this character if you have your own, just go ahead and use your own character, but for my tutorial I'll be using this character here that we created together in the previous video. Before we import this image into Unity, I do want to do one thing, which is probably not that big of a deal, but I just want to make sure we don't have any external clippings going on. So with the legs, I want to make sure they don't clip inside the body, and the way you can check that is by clicking the body, and then you can see we have this square. If the legs go inside of it or any other body part, just go ahead and drag the legs away because we don't want anything clipping on top of each other. So just kind of move them out of the way and then re-export it as a PNG image so we can use it inside Unity. If you're using a PSB file instead of a PNG image, this doesn't matter. You can have these underneath each other and everything, and it's still going to work perfectly inside Unity. But again, if you're working with PNG images, which is something that I'm quite new at because I usually do PSB files as well, make sure they're not clipping, just to make sure. So after we export it, I want to go into Unity, and I'm just going to go ahead and take my image and I'm going to drag it inside my assets folder here. Now typically we do have a sprites folder as well, so I'm going to right click, create, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this one Sprites. I'm just going to go ahead and take my player sprite and move it inside that folder. Now, if you follow up my series here, you will already have a player character where we have this little square that can move around and jump and do all this fancy stuff. But you don't have to have this. If you want to have just a completely new player character, just go ahead and go into the sprite and drag it into your scene and just call it something like player, and then you will be able to follow along just fine. Now I will be using our existing player characters, so what I want to do is I want to click my player. I want to go over to where it says sprite. I'm going to just make sure we select the sprite that we just imported. So I'm going to find it inside my project here. It's right here. Double click it, and then I'm just going to make the, undo some of the adjustments we did in the running episode, before the previous one. So I'm going to make sure it's not red, but just white, because then we don't have any weird overlays going. I'm also going to make sure that my scale is set to 1 and 1. And now the character is quite big. I made it big inside Photoshop. So what I can do is I can actually scale it down, and I'm not going to be using the scale tool up here. Instead, I'm going to go into my sprite down here in the assets folder, and I'm just going to go ahead and set pixels per unit to 200. And by increasing the number, it is going to lessen the amount, the size of the character. And for now, because we already included a rigid body and a couple of colliders to this character in the previous episode, we don't need to touch this for now because we're going to be changing the sprite. We're going to put the legs inside the sprite. We're going to put the eyes on top of it. So if we were to do any sort of collider scaling right now, it's probably not going to match up once we're done. So for now, let's just don't touch the colliders and let's change it a little bit later. So now that we have our player inside the scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the player, and what I want to do is I want to make sure we have everything set up so we can animate this guy. Right now the limbs are not inside the character because that's what it needs to be, for it to look properly. We also want to make sure we add bones and weight to this character, which basically means that, if you take like a human body, I have bones, and in between the bones I have joints. And the reason I can move the way I can, and the reason that my hand isn't just falling to the ground, is because it's attached to a couple of limbs. So that is what we need to create inside Unity, and Unity has a very good built-in feature to allow this to happen. You do want to double check though that inside Package Manager, you make sure you do have a couple of things. Make sure everything is updated, and especially make sure you have 2D animation in here, because that is what is going to help us actually animate this character. Do also make sure that you see 2D sprite in here, and if you're using a PSB file, you do also want to make sure that PSD importer is in here and updated, otherwise the PSB file might not be possible to be used. So after updating everything, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my player inside my assets window, and I'm going to make sure that if I'm using a PNG image that is a single inside Sprite Mode, if you're using a PSB file, you want to make sure this one is set to multiple. And it should just be done that by default. Like, you shouldn't need to change anything, but just double check that that is what it says and you haven't touched anything. With all of this, I'm going to go inside the sprite editor. So I'm just going to click it here. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag my sprite editor up to the top here, just so we have a little bit more space to look at. In here, we're not going to do anything inside the actual sprite editor. What we're going to do is we're going to click on the sprite editor tab up here in the left corner, and I'm going to go down to skinning editor. Inside skinning editor is where we're going to apply the bones and the weight and the geometry and everything to our sprite. So what I want to make sure I do here is I click visibility so we can actually see the hierarchy of everything that we're selecting and creating in here. I want to make sure to start with that I'm going to be creating the bones for this sprite. There's a couple of things here to note, which is that right now we do have something like eyes and we have legs, and you might think that, we probably need to take these and move them in before we start adding the bones, but we actually don't get to collect and put everything together until we have added the bones and we're done inside the sprite editor. So for now, it needs to be separated and look something like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the left where it says create bone, going to click it. And right now we can't actually create any bones. And that's, you can see if I'm clicking, nothing is happening. That's because you need to double click on your character for it to highlight and actually tell that, oh, right, there's a couple of different sprite parts here that we need to do something with. Now, I am making kind of a weird light bulb character, so if you have a person or something, of course, this is going to be a little bit more complex than what I'm making here, but it's the same general principle. If you have arms as well, then you need to do the same thing as we're doing to the legs. So it's all the same. So what I'll do is, first of all, I want to create the hip, or the base of the body. So I'm going to click at the bottom here at the center, and I'm going to drag it up till around here, and then I'm going to click it. And then you can tell we can actually continue on building bones for this character. So right now we have the body, or the hip part of the person, the light bulb, we could call it. And I'm going to create the head for the next part. So I'm just going to go all the way up, click it again. And now I actually want to start with these body parts out here, but as you can tell, we're still continuing. So I'll just right click to deselect. And then I want to say, okay, the legs, which are going to be the next thing I'm going to attach, has to be connected to the hip. So I'm going to click on the hip bone, and then you can see it actually continues it. And then I can go ahead and click inside the sprite. Make sure you click inside of them, not outside. Otherwise, this is going to be a little bit messed up. And then we're going to create the knee, and then the lower part of the foot, and then the entire foot, the lower part of the leg, it's called, not lower part of the foot. What we can do now is we can do the other leg. So I'm going to right click to deselect, and then I'm just going to continue on the other side. And then I want to select the head, and then I want to attach the eyes. And this is going to be a little bit weird for some people, because you would think that I just need to click it once and that's it. Then I can deselect, but that's not how it works. You actually need to go to the left side of the eye, drag across, click it, and deselect. Do the same thing for the other eye. Same thing for the eyebrows. So we're going to click, drag across, deselect. So now we basically have the entire character rigged. And of course, if you do have more body parts, you just need to keep attaching like I did. It really depends on, when I move the head, do I want the eyes to move with the head? That is kind of like the logic you need to think about when you need to know, okay, should I attach the eyes to the head or to the waist? Because if you're not entirely sure, then that is, usually just need to think about it logically, and then you can sort of figure things out. The next thing we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to go over to auto geometry, because now we're actually done with the bones. There's of course a couple of other tools here where you can edit the bones and do such things. For now, I think this is quite good. So what I'll do is I'll go to the geometry, which is going to be where we actually create the borders, the edges of the sprite, and how complex it needs to be with the sprite, when we twist it and turn it. So if I were to go in and go down here to where it says generate for selected, I can go ahead and make sure to have weight ticked on, because that is something, if I were to take it off, we could actually add separate down here. But for now, usually the automated generation just does a pretty good job. So I'm going to keep this on, and then I can sort of select how complex I want to have my character If your character is too simple when it comes to like how you twist it and the body just doesn't follow exactly like you want it to, then maybe you want to add a little bit more detail to the geometry in order for it to have a little bit more complexity. But do know that if you just, buff this up to max with everything, all the different characters inside your game, it does eat away of performance. A general rule of thumb is just to add just enough for you to like be happy about it. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and set the default, generate for selected, and then you can see we get this little color grading thing going on here. It's important to note the difference because the white lines that you see around the character and inside the character, that is actually the geometry that we added. The coloring is going to be the weight of the character. So if I were to take and rotate my head, how much weight should the head have compared to the body? Because if I say that the body should not have as much weight on it, the body is going to start twisting much faster with the head if I start tilting the head. So, the weight here is usually pretty good by default, but you can adjust it by the weight slider inside the weight settings here if you wanted to. So if I were to click it, make sure we have the body selected, I can decrease the weight. And then you'll notice that when I start twisting my head, the body is a little bit more giving when it comes to twisting it, so I don't want to have that. Like I said, the default one is usually pretty good. If you rotated and started doing things to test out your character, because that is a good idea to do to make sure it looks right, and you want to, reset the entire pose, then there is a button up here at the top. You can click it, and then it just resets everything. So you shouldn't worry about it looking weird if you start twisting it and oh no, did I put everything back to where it used to be? Just go ahead and click reset pose and that fixes things. So now if I want to edit my bordering, because as you can tell, I actually have a little bit of kind of a weird thing going on here. So what I can do is I can say edit geometry, and then I can actually just move them up if I want to, a little bit closer to the character, like so. And if you want to add more vertices, you can just go ahead and click create vertices, and then you can just add a little bit more complexity to it. Usually I just click create vertices because you can move around the vertices even without having the edit one selected. So you can't just kind of do this and just twist it around and make it look really nice. Now, if you're using a PNG image, you're pretty much set when it comes to the bone influences that we can mess around with in here. But if you're using a PSB file and you imported your character from Photoshop into Unity with the legs underneath the body and the eyes on top of the face, then you're going to have to do some changes in here to the bone influence. So down here, if you were to click it, you can see that right now I don't really have anything selected. So I could, if this was a PSB file, double click on one of the bones. Now, for me, nothing is going to happen because I'm using a PNG file. But for you, there will be a pop-up down here with the bone influences where it's going to tell you if this particular bone is influencing other body parts. This means that if I were to take the eye and start moving it, you want to make sure that it doesn't mess with the face and doesn't start stretching the face. So with the eye double clicked, you want to go down and click minus when you select the face, minus off the face, minus off the hip, depending on, what it has in there. You only want the eye to be affecting the eye. But like I said, for me, nothing happens when I double click because I'm using a PNG image and my eyes were not on top of the character when I imported inside Unity. So everything's fine for me. You don't want to deselect anything for the face though, because if I were to click the face, or if you're using a PSB file, double click it, then you do want to, when you start rotating the body, you want the eyes and eyebrows to start moving up and down, like it's doing right now. Because when we start animating, I do want the eyes to follow the body when we start animating him. So what I'll do here is I'm just gonna go and reset the pose. And there's one last thing that we need to do, which is the whole reason why we click visibility up here, because now we can actually see the different names for the parts, the name for the bones. We can see the depth for the bones, which is going to matter as well when we start to put together the character. The lower the number, the further back the part is going to be, or the sprite part is going to be. So the legs, I want to be underneath the body, right? So the legs are going to be the lowest point of this sprite. So they should just stay at 0. I want to just go ahead and click the leg. Oh, that's the one called bone 3. I'm going to click it. Make sure we're not inside the bone influencer. So just go ahead and click preview pose and then click it so we can actually edit it down here. And here we go. So with this, as you can tell, I made sure the base and the head were on the same layer. So I set them to 5. I took the eyes and the eyebrows and I made them on a layer 8. I also made sure to take the legs and put them on 0. Basically everything with the leg all the way down to the foot, everything was set to 0. And I didn't name the middle part because we don't need to name it or do anything to it. We just need to make sure that the leg and the foot are named, because that is all we need to have when it comes to the next couple of steps. So for now, that's all I named. So with all of this, I can actually go ahead and click apply. And once we applied it, I can go back into the scene. And now we need to start putting together the character. And once we've done that, we can then, make changes to the collider afterwards. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and make sure that my player is selected. And then I want to add a component. And this one is not going to be something you want to add if you're using a PSB file, so a Photoshop file. Because if you're using a PSB file, once you applied the different bones inside the sprite editor, you're going to notice that your player is going to have a drop-down arrow with a bunch of body parts. And those body parts are going to be set to the names of the bones that we gave it inside the sprite editor. So you need to skip this step if you're using a PSB file, but if you're using a PNG file like I am, you need to go ahead and go down inside your add component, and you want to make sure you add a Sprite Skin. And with that, you need to make sure you click on create bones. So once you do that, you can see that all the bones that we added to it inside the sprite editor are going to be applied to our sprite. So I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in here. And what we need to do is we need to start moving these around. So it needs to look like how we want it to look like inside our characters. So for example, my leg, just gonna go ahead and take it, gonna move it in, and take the other leg, move it in as well. The eye, and we can actually, if the camera is kind of in the way here, we can go up and just sort of click the eye icon on the hierarchy window and just like unselect it so we can't see it, like so. Just so we have something that, looks like a character. And we can go into the y-axis here and just copy it, make sure that it is set to the same one. Oh, not the y-axis, the x-axis, because they're actually turned around when it comes to, the bones. It's kind of weird. X-axis is up and down, and y-axis is left and right, so it's opposite day. So you want to make sure you have x-axis and x-axis the same. So now that we put together the character, we could go ahead and just sort of adjust the collider, because we will need to animate this and have him walk around. So I will click the player. And we did already add colliders in the previous video, so you can just, if you have your own little sprite and you didn't follow the previous videos, just go ahead and add a collider and, change it so it matches with what you want it to be. And then I also want to make sure that we take the box collider, which is the one that checks if we can jump. And we want to make sure we move that down as well. There we go. So now we have all the colliders like they're supposed to be. So with the colliders adjusted, the last thing we need to do in order to animate this character is that we need to add another component. And this one you do need to add whether you're choosing a PNG file or a PSB file. So this has to be for both of them. So we're going to go down add components, search for IK Manager 2D, which is going to be the component that actually takes care of having these bones work together. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and say I want to add a new to my list down here, because right now, as you can see, the list is empty. So I'll click add, and I'll add a limb. Once we have that added, I can go ahead and change the name of it. So right now you can see we have this new game object up here called new limb solver 2D. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it something like leg underscore right underscore limb solver 2D. I can then click it and make sure we take the foot of my right leg. So I'm just going to go ahead into where we have the right foot, which is up here. I'm just going to go ahead and drag that into the effector that I have inside this game object component. So with that dragged in there, what I also do want to make sure is that my game object, the one that was just created, is actually positioned the correct place. So in order to see it properly, we will need to go up and make sure we have the move tool selected. So as you can see, we now have these that we can drag around. And I want to make sure it's moved down somewhere near the foot. I'm just going to put it right underneath the tip of my toe. Oh, we do need to make sure we do it on the right foot, because this is the right foot we're dealing with, not the left one. So with it here, I'm going to say create target. And with that, you can see it automatically creates a target for us. So what I can do is I can actually go ahead and move this, and you'll actually notice that we have some magic going on. The entire leg is moving by itself. So we can actually animate this foot in this manner, and everything is going to be dragged and animated with it, which is really nice. And then we want to do the same thing for the left leg. So I'm going to go up and choose my player, go down to the component, add a new IK Manager 2D limb. And I'm just going to call this one leg left. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in the left foot inside my effector. I want to make sure it's moved down right underneath the left foot. And then I just want to say create target. Now there is something here you do need to be aware of, which is if your knee is going the opposite way like this, do make sure you click the flip button up here, because then it's going to bend the right way. So with this, we now have everything set up the way we want it to. Of course, if you do have arms, if you have other different body parts that you want to animate, that you did also add bones to inside the sprite editor, then of course you might want to include a couple more of these limbs. But for now, this is all we need for this particular character here. So what we can do now is we can actually start animating. Hooray! So I'm going to go ahead and click the player, and I want to make sure we have the animation window open. So I'm going to go to Window, Animation, have it drag down here. I'm also going to open up the Animator and drag it down to the bottom here. And inside the animation tab with the player selected, by the way, that is important, you want to say create. And then you want to create a new animation asset. Now I'm going to go back inside my main directory and I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call this one Animations. In here, I do also want to make sure that we have a good hierarchy. So I want to create a folder called Player, because this is going to contain all the player animations. And then I just want to rename my animation to player, and then the animation that I want to create. Now, as a default, you usually start out with a idle animation. So what I want to do is I want to say _idle. Again, you can name it whatever you want to, but it is just sort of a naming convention to say the name of the object, underscore, and then the animation that you want to create. So idle is him just standing still. It's not really doing anything. So we're going to save. And in here, we can now start animating. So what I'll do is I'll take my project window, just put it over to the side here, because it is kind of a neat thing to have. Now, if you were to do frame by frame animation, you usually would just go ahead and open up your sprite with all the different frames and just drag them all inside the timeline and then play it. And then you had like an entire animation playing. So you would, you know, pre-make all the different frames inside an editing software like Photoshop or After Effects. But since we're animating directly inside Unity, and we need to do it in a slightly different way. Now, inside the animation tab, there's a couple of different ways we can do it. We could go ahead and say we want to add properties and then, you know, add whatever property we want to add. So if I want to get the positioning, transform property of my body, then I can go down to the base, which is my hip. As you can see, we can actually see everything inside the player object, inside the properties down here. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and say I wanted to add the entire transform of the body, which is the hip base, and just go ahead and add it in here, right click, add, and then we can actually adjust the settings inside what we have here. But I don't want to do it that way. Let's go ahead and do this in a much simpler way, which is simply just to click the bone and then start moving it around, because that seems simpler in my mind. So what I'll do is I'll click the record button, and then what you can do is you can move it out to, let's say, 30 seconds. And then you can just go ahead and take the body, move it down slightly, and then go over to maybe 1 minute, copy the keyframes and paste them in. If I were to play this using my space key, is that we actually have an animation going. And it's just basically recording the keyframes that we're adding in because we hit the record button. But maybe I want the eyes to bounce as well. So what I can do is I can go forward to around 40 seconds or 40 frames, it's actually called. And I can actually take the eye, just move it down slightly. So it actually bounces down when we, you know, move. So something like this. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to anyone? So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and start doing this with the rest of the body as well. So we have the eyebrow, we have the other eye, the other eyebrow, and I'll just do everything like I just did here. So I'll just go ahead and do that really quick. And now I have something like this. There's something else I want to do, which I don't know, I think could be kind of cool to do. So what I'll do as well is I will. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure the head bounces forward and backwards while he's doing this. So what I can do is I can also go forward to where we have this little leg bounce. And I want to make sure that I select my head, which is right here. And I want to rotate it. So once we get over here, let's make sure we choose the right one. I do think it is the Z axis. So we want to bounce a little bit. So once I start bouncing, you can see the head bounces down and then we want to bounce back up again. So now we have something that looks something like this. Now, of course, you can spend a lot more time on animating it. I'm doing a tutorial, so I'm just going to do some really rough sketching here or some rough animations. But I think this is fine for now. So what I want to do now is I want to add a running animation. So what I can do is I can go down to where it says player idle. We have this little drop down. I'm going to click it, and then I'm going to add a new clip. So I'm going to save this one inside my player animations folder. I'm going to call this one player _ run. And then we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to make a running animation. So what I can do, let's go ahead and do it the other way this time. So what I'll do is I'll add property. I'll go down to the base, and I want to say that I want to add the entire transform of the base. So I'm going to click it, then I'm going to open up the head, then I'm going to hold down Control, click transform for my head. Then I also want to open up the eyes. And for this one, I just want to have the height going. I don't want to have the rotation or anything else. So I'll open up the transform and say I want the positioning. Hold down Control as well. Select it. Left eye. Position. Eyebrow as well. Position. Open up. Position. And then we don't want to have the leg, but we want to have the leg limb solver, which is down here. So I'm going to make sure we hold down Control, select the transform, and then the transform for the other leg. I'm going to right click, add properties, and now we have all these properties down here. So now you can see we have keyframes going at 0 frames and also at 60 frames over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go forward to 40 frames, and I want to say that I want to add a little bit of bobbing again for the body. So I just want to make sure I have my recording enabled. There we go. Move them down slightly. So now we have this little bounce going on from the beginning. What I'll do as well is I'll add a little bit of rotation to it. So once we start running, we want to rotate. So we start running and going up again. Now I do want to make sure that we also bounce backwards. So I'm going to drag these frames over to 20 instead. So once we get to 40, I actually want this to rotate the other way. So with this, I want to make sure that my legs are moving as well. So I want to make sure I step up somewhere around here. So we step up, we stomp down, step up, stomp down, and slide. And at this sliding motion, I probably want to copy the keyframe, and I just want to go over and make sure that is the starting frame as well. So we have a start and it slides over. Then I want to do the other leg. And if you know a little bit about animation, which I know little about, then I want to make sure that my other foot is actually sliding as he steps forward. So I want to make sure that once we get to the step, the other foot is sliding back. So we step, we start sliding, we step, and we step down. I'm concentrating, okay? So it is hard to talk while I'm doing it. Just kind of like move the timeline and feel your way, and it's gonna look right at some point. And I think something like this just to begin with. I messed around with it for about a minute or so, and now I have something that looks like this. So we have a walking cycle. I do also want to make sure I add the eyes and the eyebrows because they should bounce as well. So let me just go ahead and fix that. So something like this. If we were to play it, you can see the eyes are also doing something. And then the last thing is I want to make sure that the head is, doing the bouncing thing that we did with the idle animation as well. So something like this. So if we were to play it again, you can see we have a little bit of bounce going on, which looks a little bit more organic, I think. And of course, if you wanted to add a jump animation or anything else to this character, you can just go ahead and go in and say you want to create a new clip and just call it player _ jump, and then you can add a jump animation. So it is really pretty simple to do. So what I'll do is I'll go inside the animator, and what you'll notice is that we need to make sure we have our player selected. And inside the animator with the player selected, we will now see that we have a player idle, which is the first one that we created. And then we have a player run. And these are different animation states that we can actually change between depending on what we're doing inside the game. Now, if you accidentally created a player run to begin with, you can just right click on the other one and say you want to set it as a default layer state. And then that one is going to be your idle animation. So just know that you can change your mind if you change something, if you made the running first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a transition, because in order to switch from idle to run, when we start moving, we need to have a transition set up. So I'll right click, make transition, move it over to run. Then I'll right click on run and transition it back to idle. This is important because if we don't add a transition back to idle, then once we stop running, we're not going to go back to being idle again. So that is something we need to add. Now, before we start making changes to the transition, I do want to go into parameters, which is over here on the left, and I want to add a new parameter. This one is going to be a float because it's going to be a number that determines if we're actually running or if we're standing still. So I'm going to say I want to create a float and call it something like speed or run or something, something that indicates to us what this number is going to be. So this one is just going to be the speed of the character. And with that created, I can go in and click on the little transition. And inside my inspector, I'm going to make sure that when I transition from one animation to another one, that it looks correct. No exit time, because we want to make sure that we have a instantaneous change from idle to run. We don't want the full animation to finish playing before he starts running. So I want to make sure the has exit time is deselected. I want to make sure the fixed duration is unchecked. And I also want to have a transition duration set to 0. And we want to do that for all the transitions. So going to say the from run to idle, unselect has exit time, fixed duration, set this one to 0. Once we've done that, we do also want to make sure that the condition that we created down here, which is the parameter, is set up inside these transitions. So I want to make sure that when I go from running to idle, I need to check if my speed, by clicking the little plus icon inside conditions, is lesser than 0.1. And now the reason I'm writing 0.1 is because we want to have a margin of error. So if we're not standing completely still according to the code, but technically we are, then I want to make sure it still registers that we're standing still. So 0.1 is better than 0 because you might end up not getting the transition working properly. And the same thing is for the other transition. So when we want to go from idle to run, then we want to check if we have a parameter that is greater than 0.1. So the speed should be greater than that. So what I can do is I can actually test this out. So I can click play. And once we start playing, you can see that the idle animation is the default state that's playing. I can go down inside my parameters and actually change this to 1. And then you can see we start running. Change it back to 0 or nothing. Then we go back to idle. And by doing this, we can actually test that everything is working. So with this, I'm just going to go ahead and stop playing. We're going to go inside our player controller, which is the script we have attached to our player. And before we go into Visual Studio, I just want to show something, which is that if I were to click on the player, you'll notice that we have a animator component, which is something that we added once we actually created our first idle animation. It automatically adds it to our player. So we do have an animator component inside our player. That is important to note, because once we go inside Visual Studio, we do need to make sure that we actually grab the animator component in order to, change the animation. So at the very top here, I want to make sure that I set a private animator. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this one something like animate. Then I want to make sure we actually grab the animator component, because right now we just created a empty field. So I want to make sure we go down inside our start function, and I want to set animate equal to game object dot get. We can actually just copy paste. Why don't we just do that? That is a little bit faster. And then I'm going to change it to the animator we want to grab. Once we have the animator, we can actually change the state of our animation. So what I'll do is I'll scroll down to fixed update. And what I want to do is, if I'm moving, which right now is inside this if statement here, then I'm just going to change the float parameter that we created inside our animator inside Unity. So what I can do is I can say I want to grab the animate that we just created up there, dot set float, which is a function that we get once we have the animator component, parentheses, semicolon. And then I want to say what parameter are we trying to change here. I want to change the one we called speed, because that's the name we gave it. And then I want to change the speed to whatever our move horizontal value is when we start moving the character. Because remember, anytime we're clicking on A or D or left or right on the keyboard, our horizontal value is going to go either to 1 if we're going right, or -1 if we're going to the left. And it's going to be 0 if we're standing still. However, there's going to be a problem here, because right now inside Unity, inside the animator, you can see that right now we're checking if our speed is greater than 0.1 or lesser than 0.1. So what happens if I go to the left with my character? Well, right now move horizontal is actually going to become -1. So even though I'm moving to the left, it's going to play the idle animation. So what we can do is we can actually add in a function that will take our number and always make it into positive. We don't want to have any negative numbers, which means that if I'm moving to the left and I'm getting -1, it's just going to change it into 1 instead. So I'm going to go ahead and say we want to use a function called math f dot apps parentheses and make sure that move horizontal is inside the parentheses, like so. Now we do need to fix something here really quick because we don't want to have this inside our if statement. That was a mistake on my end. Otherwise it will never check for idle because it's only going to check the animation once we're actually running. So we want to make sure it's just inside either update or fixed update. I'm just going to go ahead and put it inside update because this is not a physics-based thing we're trying to move here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass it inside, paste it inside update. Going back inside Unity, we can actually go ahead and play, see what happens. And as you'll notice, when I move left or right, he starts running or walking or whatever we might call it. But we do have quite a bit of a fast running speed. So let's go back inside Unity and just sort of, you know, damp it down a little bit so we don't run so fast. Let's try and set it to 1 for the move speed. And then you'll notice that we have something that looks a bit more realistic. Of course, you can speed up the animation if you want to, so it matches, you know, if you want your character to go a little bit faster than this. But something else we're going to have to fix that you might have noticed is the fact that right now we are not flipping the character if we're going the opposite direction. So what I'm going to do to fix this and actually flip the character is I want to check if I'm going right, because right now as a default my character is set to be looking right, so that is fine. But once I look to the left, I want to make sure that we flip the character. So inside my start here, or actually inside my fields, I want to create a new Boolean, which is going to be private, which I know it is by default if you don't write anything in front of, but it is just kind of neat to have it. So we'll write a private Boolean, and I want to set this one to facing right. And I'm going to set it equal to true, because like I said, as a default, we are going to be facing right when we start the game. Then I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom, and I want to make sure I create a function that is going to flip my character if I'm looking to the left side. So I'm going to say I have a void flip parentheses curly brackets, and inside this flip method all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, whatever the character is right now, so if I'm looking right, when I call on this method I want to flip him to the other side. So what I can do is I can take my facing right variable and say that I want to set it equal to the opposite of what it is right now. So because facing right now is true, if I were to say exclamation mark facing right, then it's going to be equal to the opposite, which is going to be false next time I call on it. And then what we simply need to do is to flip the character, because right now we're just telling it that we want to flip it, but we haven't actually done so. So I'm going to create a vector 2. I'm going to call this one current scale, and I'm going to set it equal to the current scaling of our player. So I'm going to say transform dot local scale. Local scale is just basically going to take the current scaling of our player. So right now it's 1 and 1 on the X and Y axis. So what I want to do is I want to flip this one. And we can simply do that by flipping the X axis. And just to kind of show you what I mean, if I were to go back inside Unity, if I take my player, right now his scale is set to 1. If I were to write -1, he's actually going to flip. So what I'll do is inside my code is I'll say that we want to have a current scale dot X to grab the X axis. And I want to set it multiply equal to -1. And this is basically just me taking the current parameter, which is X right now, which is equal to 1. And then I want to multiply it by -1, which means that 1 times -1 is equal to -1. And then I want to set it equal to itself, just like we did up here, basically. And then we just basically go in and say we want to transform the local scale of the current player into whatever the result is of current scale. So we'll say transform to grab the player's transform component, and then we'll say dot local scale and set it equal to current scale. And we now basically have a method that is going to flip the player. So now all we need to do is we need to make sure we call on this one. So inside my update, I want to say if horizontal move, or move horizontal is called, is greater than 0, and I am not currently facing right, Then I want to call on the flip method. So I'm just going to copy it, paste it in here. And then I want to do the opposite for if I'm doing the other direction. So I'm going to create a else if statement. So else if move is less than 0 and I am facing right. So now if I were to go back inside Unity and were to play my game, you can see that if I'm going to the right side, just like before, we're going the right direction. But if we were to click on the left button, we're now flipping the player and going the opposite direction. And just like that, we can animate a character inside Unity. And again, if you want to do something about the speed of how he's running around, you can go inside our animation and make sure you have the player selected. And if you were to click on the run animation, you can take everything by just making sure to select all the top keyframes. And then you can actually drag it down to be a little bit faster if you needed to. So if I were to play this, you can see he's running a little bit faster. And if I were to go inside my code, we can also change the speed of the player. So, you know, he's actually a little bit faster inside the game. 0.5. I think should be better. And now you can see, you know, we can speed up the animation to work a little bit better. We could also add a little bit more of linear drag, you know, in order to probably make this a little bit better, like so. You know, adding a little bit extra drag is gonna help. So basically this is how we can animate our characters and have them, you know, move while they're standing still and run when they're actually running. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you guys in the next one.